The RPG genre comes in all shapes, sizes, and styles. Whether it's an epic sci-fi opera where your decisions shape the story, or if it's a fantasy setting where you cast spells and fight goblins, the genre has covered pretty much everything you can imagine. Yet one series stands out so much with its themes, setting, and writing that it effectively became a subgenre. It's a series beloved by many, and its legacy is undeniable. Known in its country of origins as a mother series, it's a franchise with a troubled past in regards to localization. The only title that released outside of Japan on the same platform was the second game, which was renamed Earthbound and was quickly regarded as an obscure masterpiece by the few who played it. After the series slowly gained more exposure through message boards and gaming related media outlets, people started to request Nintendo to re-release the games on modern consoles for the rest of the world to enjoy. Eventually, Nintendo delivered Earthbound on the Wii U Virtual Console, and for the first time ever, Europe got in on the action. But that wasn't enough, as the even higher regarded Mother 3 still hadn't seen the light of day outside of Japan. The thirst for the third installment is so real that it reached Half-Life 3 levels of notoriety and inside jokes. Nintendo isn't oblivious to the pleas for the localization of Mother 3, and decided to fulfill the people's wishes. However, it seemed like Nintendo got the wrong memo, and instead of releasing the third game in the series, they decided to release the first Mother game. Originally on NES, now on Wii U, under the title of Earthbound Beginnings. There certainly are people out there interested in how the series got started, and while the release for Mother 3 might still be a ways off, maybe the first game can keep fans occupied for a while. And maybe this might be the jumping in point for new players. Earthbound Beginnings' story is simple. One night, the game's main protagonist Ninten wakes up after tremors shake his entire house. Not even a minute after waking up and attempting to investigate, our half-awake hero gets attacked by a lamp. This first battle immediately sets up the game's insane, quirky, and bizarre nature. After the tremors subside, Ninten's always absent father explains to him on the phone that he has latent psychic powers and must travel the country to save the world. There is little setup, and the way the main premise is just thrown on the player is jarring, but it all fits with the surreal vibe the entire game gives off. Not much later, you learn that you must find 8 pieces of a melody, giving players a clearer sense of purpose. There's not much in terms of plot development or actual narrative going on, aside from the main story, which never gets expanded upon until the very end of the game, where it, along with the ending, does manage to have some heartfelt moments. Though players will have to endure until the end to get anything out of the story, which might be a bit much for most who want an actual plot. The locations you will visit all have a story going on, but the problem is that most plot points only get solved once the game is finished, if they even get resolved at all. That being said, the game's writing is certainly in line with other Earthbound titles, with all characters having weird and quirky dialogue. Talking to anyone in the game and seeing what they have to say is part of the journey, and a surreal experience at that. On his journey, Ninten will recruit others to his cause. And while these party members have some character, there's little to no character growth until the last part of the game. And even then, it's nothing too noteworthy, and in one case, completely comes out of the left field. The party, just like the main story, isn't anything special, and the parts of the game's narrative that are actually interesting still requires that players manage to continue actually playing Earthbound Beginnings, which might be a deal breaker. As far as gameplay goes, Beginnings is very by the numbers. It's basically a reskinned Dragon Warriors game, but the skin itself is what makes things more interesting. All attacks and status effects work in the same way as other RPGs, but have been renamed in order to fit the setting more. Instead of debuff spells, enemies yell crude words, or instead of being poisoned, your party can catch the cold. Players can attack, run, guard, use items and PSI powers, or check out the enemy to learn their stats. PSI powers are the equivalent of magic and can heal the party, inflict elemental damage, and buff or debuff enemies or allies. Early on, battles can get incredibly tedious, because pretty much all the player will do is attack. Things get a bit more in-depth later on, but even then, most fights can become a dull routine. NES RPGs are pretty notorious for how rudimentary, slow, and hard they can be, and while Earthbound's setting is unique, it is also guilty of committing these sins. The international release adds an auto feature, where the game basically plays itself during battles, and a speed button that functions as a run, which are nice new additions that speed up the pace of the game, but for most, these additions won't be enough. The encounter rate is through the roof, with players sometimes not even being able to take more than a single step before running into another enemy. Most enemies are brutal, and while the game gives players a healing spell early on to alleviate the toughness of the game a bit, it's not enough. This means you're still better off grinding a lot in the early game. When new members join the party, they start off at level 1, and that means you're gonna have to grind even more. The world of Earthbound Beginnings is giant compared to other games on the platform, and it might be one of, if not the biggest overworld in a NES game. There are a lot of branching spaces, but soon enough you will come to discover that all of it is pointless because there's no actual reward for exploring. It's these archaic things that will keep most people from actually playing the game. Later games in the series might not have very unique gameplay mechanics, but they were fairly engaging and easy enough for players to get through and see what's next in store. With Beginnings, players will have to get through a slow and hard game that's still Earthbound to its core, though prominently not as much. Presentation is a big part of the franchise, with its unique brand of psychedelic visuals, quirky charms, and an all-around surreal feel. Beginnings is no exception, with its unique sounding music and down-to-earth yet simultaneously crazy locales. Simple places like factories and abandoned houses make up the dungeons, filled with dangerous foes like rats, bats, dust balls, and zombies. Most enemies are simple in concept, and most children will or have grown up close to at least some of the locales the party visits. It's easy to see the journey Nintendo goes through as just make-believe adventures he and his friends came up with, and that's a big part of the game's appeal. It's really good at making you experience the world just as a child would. Some areas are a bit more fantastical, which makes coming across them fill the players with a sense of awe. Those that can stomach the old design ideas and hard combat will stick around just to see what places they will visit, or what crazy kind of enemy they will encounter next. The music is a delight to the ears, with most tracks having a sense of adventure, are uplifting and incredibly catchy to boot. And when it's not, the tracks perfectly convey the mood or area the game is trying to portray. Much like the rest, these visuals only add to the charm of the game, with environments almost looking like they were made in Microsoft Paint. The sprites themselves are nicely detailed, with the occasional sprite being messy and it being hard to tell what some sprites are supposed to be. Overworld characters clearly draw their inspiration from the Peanuts comic strips, and further strengthen the vibe of a game set in the American suburbs. By far, Earthbound Beginnings' strongest suit is its presentation, which is unique to its own, and its soundtrack, which is some of the best music the Nintendo Entertainment System has ever produced. What the series is known for is here in the beginning, though not as predominant. Quirky can still be used to describe its characters, dialogue, and setting, but the heartfelt emotional moments that are a series staple is pretty much non-existent, with the exception of a few moments near the end of the game. Once the main objective gets established, the story grinds to a halt until the game's last section. Unlike the rest of the game, the battle system is nothing to write home about. Like any game in this genre at the time, Earthbound Beginnings suffers from the same old dated design ideas from back in the day. Enemies are incredibly powerful, and the encounter rate is high, so a lot of tedious grinding is mostly the answer. Beginnings' world is one of the biggest on the system, but exploration is only rewarded with more encounters and frustration. The game does make things easier with Nintendo unlocking a healing PSI early on, and breath functioning as either health or a teleportation item. The presentation is where the game shines brightest, with some of the best and unique music on the system. Areas are all visually interesting due to this setting, with a few bizarre dreamlike areas taking the player by surprise. This Earthbound is a clear blueprint, which was used to build on top of and create two of the most beloved RPGs and video games ever. Sadly, there's not much to experience here for most people, bar from maybe the biggest fans of the series or players with a lot of patience. Promotional material for the game states, no crying until the end, but it's doubtful that a lot of players will actually be crying, unless it's due to frustration. There we go, that's another review done. I'm really happy that it was a game like this. First off, I'm really glad that I finally finished the review because, like, it's an RPG. It took me quite a while to get through, which means I have a lot of footage. My PC has been cluttered up with like over 200 gigs of Earthbound Beginnings footage, which makes it hard for me to work. But I finally get to just delete that after this. I'm also happy that it was Earthbound Beginnings, which is an older game. I just kind of play whatever comes across my desk. I don't prefer a certain genre, style, or game from a certain era. So that's what I really like about like the reviews I do. There's always something different. The next time it might be a big AAA game on the Xbox One that recently came out. And another time it might be this really obscure game no one heard about on the Game Boy. I really like that, and I'm glad I finally got to tackle one of the older games. Despite my review actually giving the game a rather low score, I had a really fun time with it because it was ages since I've played just an old school simple RPG, which was like a treat for me to do again. But I'm also one of the crazy people who works in a very systematic way when it comes to RPGs. So the grinding and all that stuff didn't bother me as much because that's kind of the way I play those games. But yeah, the grinding is never a good thing. It's just unnecessary padding of a game. One thing I didn't mention was, and I don't know if it's specifically to my setup or if it's just the Wii U Virtual Console version or if it's also on the original NES or the unreleased cartridge or on emulators, but the controls are kinda unresponsive at moments. Sometimes it takes like a double press or it takes a second before the game registers it, which is kind of annoying, but it doesn't like affect the game too much. It's kind of like, oh come on, and then you move, but it doesn't like you don't die because of it. So I didn't think it was that much of an important thing to bring up. And yeah, that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the review. If there's anything you want to tell me, feel free to leave a comment below or send me an email or anything. Yeah, I'll see you at the next review.